Order, please. I'll welcome the witnesses here, and we are furthering our discussions under the order of reference of Tuesday, May 10th on Bill C-15, an act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 22nd, 2016, and other measures. We have quite a number of witnesses here this morning. I would say in beginning that the committee is going to be disrupted by a vote sometime between now and the next hour. When the bells go, I will ask if there's unanimous consent of the committee to stay until we're down to 15 minutes before the vote, and then we'll come back after that vote to continue our hearings. We know people have traveled a distance, put a lot of work into their presentations, and we certainly want to hear from them. So we'll start with the Fonds de Solidarité de Travail du Québec. My French is not very good. Mr. Gaëtan Morin, President and Chief Executive Officer, and Mario Tremblay, Vice President. The floor is yours.
Bonjour, bonjour.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for inviting us. The Quebec Labour Solidarity Fund contributed two major public objectives, that is, to promote savings among middle-class workers and channeling these savings toward businesses in order to stimulate economic growth. Year in and year out, we provide more than $500 million to provide SMEs in all sectors of the economy and at all stages of development. We invest directly in businesses and indirectly in private venture funds by non-guaranteed risk capital amounts. Since 2005, the fund has contributed over $1.2 billion to financing 55 private venture funds, which has supported the ecosystem of venture capital initiatives not only in Quebec but throughout Canada. It is for this reason, in fact, that we have the unwavering support of the Canadian Venture Capital and Private Equity Association, the CVCA. The decision of Mr. Trudeau's government to support the tax credit of 15% granted to savers who invest in us is founded on solid economic arguments. Many chambers of commerce and business associations, among them the Chamber of Commerce of Canada, have expressed to the Minister of Finance that this is the case since 2013. And for every dollar of tax credit in the program, the fund invests $6.05. Without us, this capital would not be used to support SMEs, innovation, venture capital, and prosperity. Secondly, according to CVCA figures, the fund was in 2015 the most active non-governmental investor in the venture capital area in Canada. We have invested in each of the 5 private and independent funds that are the most active, that is Real Ventures, Innovia Capital, Relay Ventures, Cycle Capital, and Lumira Capital. Thirdly, approximately $8.4 billion have been raised by independent private funds in Canada between 2004 and 2015. 41 private funds for a total of $4.6 billion have benefited either directly or indirectly by our investments or through 2 other fiscally funded groups in Quebec. Fourthly, with regard to retirement funds, studies have shown that the behavior of our shareholders has led to an improvement in individual saving practices. Thanks to salary withholdings, they've developed healthy savings habits and are beginning to save in other financial establishments. Through the strength of its renewed partnership with the Government of Canada, the fund is undertaking a new chapter in its history. Over the past several months, we have come up with a strategic plan in order to identify the best possible ways for us to contribute better to economic development, to job creation, and to the objectives which we share with the Canadian government. April 22nd last, I announced before the Montreal Chamber of Commerce that the fund would be investing $3 billion before 2020 in order to support some sectors of excellence in the economy, like life sciences, agri-food, aerospace, and forestry products. Of this initial amount, $900 million will be new money that we will get from selling shares that we have from major markets and that we will then reinvest in the economy here. Other than the sectors I've already mentioned, we have also the intention of investing further in innovative businesses, the importance of innovation. The fund has started new initiatives, and in fact, we are now associated with the Manufacturiers et Exportateurs du Québec to undertake a regional tour. We want to stimulate innovation in our partner enterprises. We've already started by targeting those who desire to innovate and that could benefit from this personalized support. The development of real estate infrastructure for socioeconomic purposes is also a major challenge for governments. This is why the fund will deploy $400 million to finance real estate infrastructure in small and medium-sized enterprises like schools, libraries, sporting complexes, and student residences. The projects that we hope to undertake will be developed in partnership with cities, school boards, and governments. And thanks to this effort, we will invest more than $2 billion in new projects because of this initial way of doing things. As you have seen, the fund has the means and the expertise to invest in businesses in all sectors of the economy and at all stages of their development. We also have the means and the expertise to stimulate innovation and to invest in infrastructure. However, we do not act alone. We will do it with our shareholders and savers, with our partners, and with governments. We also will do it with our colleagues of the financial sector like Investissement Québec, the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec, and the Canadian Development Bank, as well as venture capital funds everywhere in Canada with whom we work in partnership. Thank you for your attention.
With Restaurants Canada, Ms. Reynolds.
To be here today to provide comment on the budget on behalf of Canada's $75 billion restaurant industry. Restaurants Canada is a national association representing a growing community of 30,000 businesses in every segment of food service, including restaurants, bars, caterers, full and quick service restaurants, and food service management companies. With 94,000 locations and 18 million customers every day, the restaurant industry has a more personal, direct, and frequent connection with Canadians than just about any other industry. The restaurant and food service industry is one of the largest private sector employers in the country, with 1.2 million employees, and we are most proud of the first job opportunities we provide for youth, more than any other industry in Canada. Restaurants also open doors for many new Canadians as they seek to establish themselves in a new country and to gain work experience and contacts in the Canadian job market. So now the budget. Some of the things that we like include, first off, the renewed youth employment strategy with additional funding for vulnerable youth and for an expanded Canada Summer Jobs program. We are grateful for your commitment to youth and youth employment, and we look forward to working with your government on a youth employment growth strategy. Second, $50 million in additional funding to promote Canada as a tourist destination. Restaurants account for 27% of total tourism jobs, largest of any sector. And of course, dining out is something that almost every tourist will do when they are here in Canada. And our cuisine can compete with the best in the world, and we need to promote Canada as a culinary destination. Third, a commitment to review spending in the tax system to make it more efficient and effective. Our members find the tax system overly complex, taking valuable time away from running their businesses. A more streamlined system with an objective of more broad-based tax reduction is something that we support. Fourth, tax breaks that will lead to an increase in disposable income for the middle class, and hopefully more spending in restaurants. And fifth, higher permanent resident admissions with more funding to process permanent residents and for settlement programs. Our diverse, multicultural industry was built and continues to be built by immigrants. Now, on the flip side, Restaurants Canada is very disappointed about the deferment of the small business tax reduction beyond 2016. This was one of the government's election commitments that was strongly supported by restaurants. In fact, all parties committed to reduce the small business tax rate to 9% by 2019. And while the rate will decrease this year from 11% to 10.5%, future cuts remain up in the air. We were even more disappointed when the government's election commitment to implement an EI Youth Hires initiative was missing from the budget. Employers of youth were promised an EI premium holiday from payroll costs for youth hires beginning in 2016. Recognizing that youth unemployment rate is more than double the unemployment rate for Canadians over the age of 25, we think that a payroll tax reduction for youth employers should be the cornerstone of any youth employment growth strategy. CPP enhancements were also part of the government's election platform and were touched on in the budget. As with EI, Restaurants Canada recommends that enhancements to CPP be targeted to Canadians needing additional retirement earning support without jeopardizing youth jobs. And I'd be happy to expand on this during the question period. Finally, I'd like to touch on one other issue that we included in our pre-budget submission that wasn't included in the budget, which is the high cost of credit card acceptance fees. These fees have long been a major source of concern for restaurant operators. Canadians are being incented to use their cards for all types of purchases, from their morning coffee to basic groceries, to take advantage of generous reward points and cashback deals. But these rewards and deals are financed through the high processing fees charged to merchants. We are encouraged that there is a private member's bill before Parliament sponsored by MP Lapointe, which we will support, and that we hope that will lead to a regulatory cap on credit card acceptance fees, and we hope that this committee will support this bill as well. So to conclude, I'm here representing the industry that's in every Canadian community, urban and rural. We build neighbourhoods, attract tourists, and provide more first jobs than any other industry. With the right measures in place, we can contribute even more to the employment of youth and to a strong and growing economy. And I look forward to a productive discussion with you during question period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Reynolds. With the Office of the Veterans Ombudsman, Mr. Perrant, I would say as well, if any of you do want to indicate which sections of the Budget Implementation Act you're speaking to, we'd appreciate that as well. I expect, Mr. Perrant, you're certainly on Part 4 of Division 2 of Part 4. Go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with you my thoughts on Bill C-15, the Budget Implementation Act, as it pertains to Canada's veterans.
Ombudsman, I have met with and listened intently to the concerns of thousands of veterans and Canadian veterans and their families across Canada. On October the 1st, 2013, I released my report of the new Veterans Charter, which was evidence-based, and for the first time in relation to any report of this nature, it was supported by an independent actuarial analysis that pinpointed exactly where benefits were failing veterans and would continue to fail them unless changes were made. In addition, on August 19, 2014, I published another evidence-based report on the Permanent Impairment Allowance and the Permanent Impairment Allowance Supplement, and recommended changes in order to better support our severely injured veterans. Le projet de loi C-15 porte...
Bill C-15 addresses several of my key recommendations in both of these reports. Although it is too early to provide you with an evidence-based analysis on the effectiveness or fairness of the proposed legislative changes, because we do not have all of the details yet, it is not too early to say that it is a movement in the right direction.
Take steps to help veterans and their families by, first of all, increasing the earnings loss benefit to 90% of an eligible veteran's military salary. According to Veterans Affairs Canada's number, this will provide increased short-term financial support to approximately 3,000 veterans while they participate in the department's rehabilitation programs. It will also provide increased long-term financial support to around 2,000 of the most seriously injured veterans. Changing permanent impairment allowance grade determination. Although I do not as yet have the details of what this change will look like for veterans, I'm hopeful that it will better support the more seriously impaired veterans with career-limiting service-related injuries. Also, I'm pleased to see the program renamed Career Impact Allowance in order to better reflect the original intent. Replacing totally and permanently incapacitated with diminished earning capacity. There is no definition yet of diminished earning capacity, so it is difficult to assess at this point. However, I am hopeful that it will lower the threshold for access to certain benefits. Raising the disability award to $360,000. This change will align the disability award for veterans with what Canadians can receive through courts. It will also provide retroactively to approximately 55,000 veterans a one-time increase to the disability award that they have already received. And increasing the death benefit to $360,000. Once implemented, this will provide better support to the family members of those who have paid the ultimate sacrifice. These changes, especially those to the Disability Award, will have a positive impact on all veterans receiving benefits under the new Veterans Charter. Other changes, such as those to the earnings loss benefit, permanent and permanent allowance, will provide greater lifetime financial security to relatively few veterans. But they are the veterans who are the most. On veterans are approximately 1% of the current federal expenditures, and current estimates suggest they will decline over the next year due to a decrease in the veterans population. As the Veterans Ombudsman, my office evaluates fairness to the principles of adequacy. Are the right programs and services in place to meet the needs? In terms of sufficiency, are the right programs and services sufficiently resourced? And accessibility, are eligibility criteria creating unfair barriers, and can the benefits and services provided by VAC be accessed easily and quickly? While it is difficult to evaluate the fairness of the proposed changes without more detail, as I said earlier in my remarks, they do reflect the recommendations I have previously made in the financial benefits and the new Veterans Charter. In closing, I believe that the proposed changes represent an important step forward in Canada's support to veterans and their family. They deserve no less in return for their service and sacrifices to Canada and the Canadians. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Perrin. Ms. McEwen with the Canadian Labour Congress. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm here on behalf of the 3.3 million members of the Canadian Labour Congress, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to present our views on this Budget Implementation Act. The CLC brings together Canada's national and international unions, along with provincial and territorial federations of labour, and 130 district labour councils, whose members work in virtually all sectors of the Canadian economy, in all occupations, and in all parts of Canada. There are many elements of Bill C-15 that will affect our members, but due to time constraints, I will focus my comments on the Old Age Security and Guaranteed Income Supplement changes, the Employment Insurance Act, and P3 Canada. I would just like to say at the beginning that we're very glad to see several elements of this bill that will increase simplicity and fairness in taxation, and that we expect the Canada Child Benefit to have a very positive impact on lower income families with children. So with regard to Old Age Security and GIS, I'm sorry I didn't write down the division numbers. Statistics Canada's low income measure shows that nearly 600,000 Canadian seniors were living in low income in 2013. This proposed increase to the Guaranteed Income Supplement top-up for the lowest income seniors will directly help many that are struggling to get by. And it's an important part of a wider strategy that includes low-income affordable housing, home care supports, and an expanded Canadian pension plan. I also want to thank the government. It looks very much like something that we put in the alternative federal budget, and we're glad to see that you're taking our advice. With regard to employment insurance, we are happy about some things and critical about others. So reducing the 910 hours threshold for new entrants and re-entrants as of July 2016 will be a meaningful change in access for young workers, for recent graduates, and for new Canadians. Investments in frontline staff will reverse substantial cuts that had been made to administrative staff in EI, and we expect that that will reduce delays and confusion for unemployed workers, improving access to the program. Extending the length of work-sharing programs from 38 weeks to 76 weeks will help workers and employers who are facing tough times or who are going through some kind of structural transition. We encourage the government to work with employer and worker groups to increase awareness of this program because it can be very effective, but the take-up is often low. Extending benefits to some workers was helpful, but the rationale for limiting benefits the way that it was done is difficult to understand. There was sufficient funding in the account to temporarily extend benefits to all unemployed workers in a fair and transparent way, and that would have helped more unemployed workers. And unfortunately, some of Harper's changes to employment insurance remain in place. This includes the definition of the long-tenured worker, which Bill C-15 actually brings into the EI Act instead of getting rid of it. Since one of the requirements to be long-tenured is 7 years of EI contributions, this automatically excludes young workers. And the difference between benefits from a long-tenured worker and others was dramatic. And in 2014, the former government created additional regions for Prince Edward Island, Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and the Yukon. These new regions created significant discrepancies in access and duration of benefits for workers who are effectively operating in a single labour market. We would ask that the government immediately reverse these new regions. As well, I want to take this opportunity to repeat our long-standing call for a single national entrance requirement for employment insurance that will increase fairness of access to EI. With regard to PPP Canada, we would like to say that we feel transferring responsibility to the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities will improve transparency and oversight, and so we're encouraged by that move. However, the budget contained further signals that Ottawa intends to open up public infrastructure to private ownership, including through pension funds and asset recycling. Along with the Ontario government, Ottawa is laying the groundwork for a major expansion of private investment in and ownership of infrastructure assets. We believe that public infrastructure should be publicly financed and operated. Therefore, we call on the federal government to completely eliminate PPP Canada Incorporated and to redirect its funding to public infrastructure projects. We would also like to see comprehensive P3 accountability and transparency legislation to protect Canadians from high-cost and high-risk P3 projects. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much, Ms. McEwen. Mr. Galimberti?
Galimberti, yes.
Galimberti.
That's good.
Thank you. With the Canadian Steel Producers Association, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks first and foremost to the honourable members for the opportunity to present in front of you today on behalf of the Canadian Steel Producers Association. Our association represents 10 primary steel producers and steel product manufacturers in Canada, with member facilities located in Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. These operations directly employ over 22,000 Canadians and support an additional 100,000 Canadian jobs through indirect economic impacts associated with our operations. We welcome the government's Budget 2016 commitment to taking steps to improve Canada's ability to effectively remedy dumped and subsidized imports, as this is an area in which steel is particularly exposed. In light of the increased frequency of market-distorting trade in Canada, the CSPA views modernization of Canada's trade remedy system as critical to ensuring that our members and their employees are able to compete fairly in the global marketplace. I'd like to provide some context, if I may, for the importance of these measures. The global steel sector today is facing an unprecedented overcapacity problem. Put simply, more steel is being produced than is required by the global market. This phenomenon is driven largely by China, where demand has declined while state-supported production has increased significantly. Through their maintenance of more than 425 million metric tons of surplus capacity, which is almost 30 times the size of the entire Canadian steel market, China's state-owned and state-supported steel sector has disrupted established trade patterns and degraded the pricing of steel products globally. The result is a significant increase in market-distorting dumping and circumvention practices both from China directly and from a host of other global producers whose home markets have in many cases suffered as a result of Chinese competition. Left with no choice but to export, these nations begin doing so aggressively, dumping yet more product onto global markets and further degrading global prices. At the recent OECD high-level symposium on excess capacity and structural adjustment in the steel sector, the CSPA was encouraged to see the development of a consensus position from the governments of the European Union, Japan, Mexico, the Republic of Korea, Switzerland, Turkey, the United States, and importantly Canada, that overcapacity and adjustment challenges facing the steel industry have an important global dimension which needs to be addressed through ongoing international dialogue. Unfortunately, China refused to participate in this joint statement or support its content. The impasse here underscores Canada's need to fortify our domestic trade remedy system. Increasing instances of market-distorting trade in steel globally have been accompanied by a historic escalation in the number of new anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases initiated in 2015, with a continued escalation foreseen in 2016. Understanding this trend, Canada should take immediate action to ensure that we do not, as a jurisdiction, become an attractive place to dump product. Our NAFTA partners in the United States have taken significant action through the passage of the Trade Preferences Extension Act in June 2015 and the Trade Facilitation Enforcement Act in February 2016 to discourage dumping and circumvention in that market. Canada needs to keep pace. So with this in mind, the CSPA would express our appreciation for the inclusion in Bill C-15 of amendments to the Special Imports Measures Act, ensuring that investigations will no longer be terminated at the preliminary stage, which will allow investigators to more fully consider whether dumping and subsidizing are harming Canadian producers. And we also welcome amendments which address the timing of and process around expiry reviews, resulting in measures remaining in place for up to 10 months longer before a decision is made as to whether to extend or rescind that measure. Similarly, we're encouraged by the recent initiation, which was also promised in the budget, of public consultation on potential future changes to the Special Imports Measures Act, and we are hopeful of near-term legislative action to address the calculation of dumping margins in situations where data in a given export market understates the degree to which products are being dumped, the enhancement of enforcement options available to the Government of Canada in instances of circumvention, and clarification as regards the type of and amount of evidence the domestic industry is required to put forward to get cases initiated. The CSPA supports trade, and we believe with our efficient facilities and innovative workforces we can thrive in a free trade environment, but in order for trade to be free, it also has to be fair. C-15 takes important steps to ensure fairness in Canada's trade remedy system, and we are hopeful the consultation process will generate additional positive near-term results.
If I could just interrupt you there for a sec. The bells are going there, 30-minute bells. And I do have to ask if there's unanimous consent to stay until there's 15 minutes left on the bells. Are we agreed in that? And could we also get unanimous consent to basically change the agenda, that the witnesses that are here in the first section, that we would go to 1 o'clock. The second section of witnesses is considerably less in number. So if we could have unanimous consent to go to 1 o'clock, it would give us the opportunity to question witnesses. Are we agreed? Good. Thank you, Mr. Gamaletti. You can finish up.
We would also like to note that strong and consistent action defending Canada's fair market principles generates the needed confidence that investments in Canada will be protected against anti-competitive behaviors from other jurisdictions. In a highly capital and technology-intensive industry like steel, our members are in a constant competition with global affiliates to attract foreign direct investment into Canada. Maintenance of a free and fair market through WTO-compliant policies, like modernization of our domestic trade remedy system, or the continued enforcement of evidence-based non-market economy provisions to applicable jurisdictions like China, where state intervention in the economy is well established and harmful to Canadian industry, is crucial to securing future direct investments in Canada. The CSPA and its members were also pleased to see domestic policy measures in Budget 2016 which we believe encourage both continued investment and production in Canada. We welcome the government's $120 billion 10-year infrastructure commitment, and our members look forward to the ability to contribute to the needed modernization and rehabilitation of Canada's public infrastructure. The CSPA shares the government's view of long-term infrastructure investment as an opportunity for contributions to national economic growth, and we believe Canada's steel producers will play a substantial role in supplying critical inputs required by projects associated with infrastructure challenges of national significance. This is especially true since Canadian-sourced steel and Canadian infrastructure projects provide significant climate change benefits relative to imported alternatives. Similarly, we are encouraged by the Budget 2016 extension of the Automotive Innovation Fund through the end of 2021. We believe this type of partnership between the federal government, the Government of Ontario, and the Canadian automotive industry for the purpose of attracting strategic, large-scale research and development projects is an important component of a collaborative effort to raise the profile of Canada's strong manufacturing capabilities. In this context, in closing, I would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to appear today on this important legislation, and happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mr. Lamberti. Mr. John, I guess, or missing? Mr. John.
Yes.
With the National Pensioners Federation. Floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to present on behalf of Canadian seniors, which is the fastest growing and largest segment of the Canadian population. My name is Herb John, and I'm president of the National Pensioners Federation. With me is our counsel, Susan Ng. The National Pensioners Federation is a national, nonpartisan organization of 350 seniors chapters, clubs, groups, organizations, and individual supporters across Canada, with a collective membership of 1 million seniors and retirees devoted entirely to the welfare and interests of aging Canadians. Seniors and those who care about them will welcome the measures announced in the federal budget and which are contained in Bill C-15, but more needs to be done. Bill C-15 returns the OAS eligibility to age 65, which will be welcome news to those who are facing having to wait 2 extra years for the OAS benefit after struggling in their careers. An estimated 600,000 seniors live under the poverty line today, and this is not expected to change unless more is done to provide better income supports and reduce their critical expenses like home care and drug costs. Bill C-15 increases the GIS for single seniors beginning July 2016. Single seniors, especially women, face a far greater rate of poverty compared to their counterparts in couples. That will benefit 900,000 single seniors across Canada. While absolutely welcome, it is a maximum of just $2.60 per day. Much more needs to be done to prevent poverty among seniors. The budget announced a proposal to introduce a seniors index for OAS and GIS to help seniors keep pace with their cost of living. However, while a welcome change, the index should actually help seniors keep pace with the standard of living and should be tied to wage rate increases. Also welcome is the announcement in the budget for $200 million over 2 years to fund seniors' affordable housing without requiring a cost match from provinces, which has been a major barrier in the past. Secure housing, as we know, is a major social determinant of health. The funding of the Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement and the Canadian Institutes of Health Information is a welcome investment, provided that the Naylor report's call for a patient-focused approach to innovation is the centerpiece. Unfortunately, the budget and Bill C-15 do not address several important election promises. There is no mention of the promise to remove the requirement for a terminal diagnosis to qualify for EI compassionate leave benefit and increased flexibility in how the benefit may be used. The requirement for a terminal diagnosis has in the past stopped people from applying for the compassionate leave benefit. In addition, the flexibility in using the benefit better reflects how chronic illnesses play out. There is no mention of the promise to invest $3 billion in home care and palliative care. There is an immediate need for sustained funding and national standards on home care. The patchwork of palliative care must be addressed immediately, and this new funding will be a major first step. The promise to join the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance will incrementally reduce the cost of many drugs. However, a comprehensive national pharmacare system is necessary in order to ensure that every Canadian is able to access needed medications regardless of income or postal code. I will now turn it over to Susan Ng, who has further recommendations for the committee.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. As Herb John has already indicated, the changes in the budget and in the budget bill will go a long way to making sure that no senior ages into poverty. However, a lot more can be done. And for the immediate purposes of this committee study, there is an opportunity to both increase the amount of GIS increase beyond the $78 per month, and you can make the change retroactive to January 1st rather than starting that change July 1st. And that's an immediate step that this committee can take. But as this committee has mentioned in the past, there's a need to really look at a guaranteed minimum income. And I encourage you to start immediately on the research of that. I know that this committee has recommended it in the past. I think there are some positive indications from the government at this point. It should really happen as soon as possible. We want every Canadian not to face poverty of whatever age they happen to be. one of the measures that help us prevent poverty in old age is to make sure people have a good retirement income. And as you know, we have been on the record, and many Canadians support an increase to the CPP. At this point, while there has been a lot of talk, there has been very little action. There are a lot of promises at this point, which are also important, but we need to see some kind of action. At this point, it also seems to be that the problem is with the provinces. This committee may have full-throated support for an increase to the CPP. However, it will mean that each of the committee members and your caucuses will have to ask your provincial counterparts to step up, because at this point, it has been quite a number of years that we have been talking about this, and even if there were a change, it would take at least 3 years before it could be implemented. And we're not getting any younger. So it is important for us to look at these issues when we're talking about the changes that are in the bill. They are targeted, after all, making sure that people live without poverty, whether at any age, and especially not in retirement. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all the witnesses. We have time for the first question to the first round. Mr. Falcon-Ouellette, 7 minutes, and then we will have to suspend for votes.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming here today. I just have a few questions. So we'll move to Joyce Reynolds from the Restaurants Canada. You talk about business tax, and you know, on one hand, I understand people want their taxes to be as low, but there are so many other issues in our country that need to be addressed, and we have to try and balance out often many of these demands. Whether it's child poverty, with Canada's child benefit, which is expensive. It's a major program. It's probably the largest expansion in the social safety net in the least living memory for many people. I guess that's just my comment on some of your testimony. But I think if I had to ask you a question, have you ever thought about working with the convenience stores people? Because they've also been here previously complaining about the high cost of credit cards and the rates, and looking up setting up your own cooperative using technology today in order to create your own, not a regulatory framework, but a competition in the market where you actually challenge Visa and MasterCard and other major credit card companies. I believe those are really the only two. But to actually, use your weight of I think your 29,000 members and combine it with the convenience stores, which is 27,000, and all of a sudden you have a very large group of people who could be working together.
Thank you for the question. We have worked very closely with the Retail Council of Canada, with CFIB, with the Convenience Store Association, with the Jewelry Store Association, one of the largest coalitions to ever come together to try to take on Visa and MasterCard. It's a duopoly, and we have not been able to have any success. The answer we get often is, well, don't just say you won't accept Visa and MasterCard. But the fact of the matter is, there's always somebody that's going to accept them, and we can't afford to allow the business to go out the door. So, we were very supportive of a competition commissioner. Took the case of unfair business practices by Visa and MasterCard to a competition tribunal. And after studying it for some time, and those two companies putting in millions and millions and millions of dollars, they ended up coming up with a ruling saying a regulatory approach is the best approach on this issue. So 31 other countries around the world have taken taken a regulatory approach, a different approach, and Canada is still the country with one of the largest interchange rates in the world, 5 times higher than some other countries. So we've been banging our heads against the wall for so long on this one that we're appealing to government for help.
Okay. The next one is for the steel producers, Mr. Gallimbetti. I was just reading one of your presentations previous to this, and you quote, you talk about China steel and how it's entering into marketplace, and there's an oversupply of steel, and you highlight in one of your presentations here that the United States has taken significant action with Trade Preferences Extension Act and the Trade Facilitation Enforcement Act, and also you quote Barack Obama who on February 23rd, 2006, what is possible is making sure everyone is playing on a level playing field and that people are operating fairly. And frankly, I don't think it's any secret that China in the past has not acted fairly. This bill allows us to take more aggressive actions, so you are going to see firm, tough enforcement of our existing trade laws. And I was just wondering if you could comment on the American experience, because you highlight this in your report.
Certainly, they've taken some strong legislative action. It's an area where the U.S. administration has really turned its attention from a trade perspective. The OECD meeting that I mentioned earlier, the U.S. sent two very, very senior representatives, political representatives from the Obama administration to try to get a deal done. The U.S. has a specific steel dialogue ongoing with the Chinese. And are sort of trying to address the problem gradually. The pain in the U.S. Market is extreme. A lot of the Chinese imports are ending up there as a destination of preference. We don't want Canada to become a backdoor for the Chinese into the United States, and without sort of needed reforms to our own remedy system, we are a viable landing. So we've certainly seen the administration grow quite serious about it very recently.
But you also talk about, because there are NAFTA partners, how if we don't strengthen ours and we don't work in conjunction with the people from Mexico, the U.S. and ourselves, that we could become the back door.
Absolutely, we are a fully integrated steel market here in North America. Landed steel, for instance, and we've seen some instances where ships that we believe were originally destined for the United States have instead come to ports like Hamilton because they believe it's a more attractive place to offload. That steel on the dock in Hamilton has a negative pricing effect on the entirety of the North American market. It can just as easily be rerouted into the States.
And what's the average salary in the steel industry?
The average steel worker in Canada makes between $75,000 and $85,000. These are highly trained, highly educated individuals.
Thank you. And that's it. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Ouellette. We will suspend for the vote. Would likely be gone about 25 minutes or so, and when we return, Mr. Leipert is work. Yes, just leave everything here. Clerk will be here. Thank you. Suspend it till after the vote. Please, could people come to the table? Quiets down a little bit. Mr. Leifert, 7 minutes, reconvening on questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. I know that this was kind of a hurried exercise, so and then it was a little disjointed today, so thanks for your patience. I wanted to spend just a little time, Ms. Reynolds, in asking you a few questions relative to what probably isn't in the budget, and you made mention of it, and that is the promise that all parties had made during the election campaign about reducing the small business tax. We've also heard from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, and I think the Parliamentary Budget Officer actually did a report on that as well. What I'm interested to know if your organization has any data that sort of lays out what a cut to the small business tax of, say, 0.5%, what that means in the way of job numbers, and maybe even whether not having the cut in small business tax rate would, in fact, result in things like maybe closure of businesses. Is there any kind of data that you have to back up some of these issues?
Well, I can go back and speak to our economists to find out specifically about the difference between the 10.5 and the 9% and see if he can do some calculations in terms of what the job impact would be. But I have to say I don't have them on hand. That's fair.
If you had something that you could provide us, I think that would be very helpful. Along with that, I happen to represent a riding in Alberta, and the provincial government has started a very aggressive increasing in the minimum wage. What does the minimum wage, and I know this is not necessarily tied into the federal budget, but the combination of no tax relief at the same time as being forced by government to pay higher minimum wage, and probably is going to be impacted with the government has certainly indicated federally that they're looking at increasing the CPP premiums. Are these issues as well that impact your members on a significant basis?
Well, the minimum wage issue in Alberta is very concerning to our members. We are looking at many restaurants that are struggling to hold on to their businesses and hold on to their employees, given the huge downturn in the economy. We surveyed our members on the impact of minimum wage increase that happened last September and the potential of a $15 minimum wage under the current economic situation in Alberta. And 49% said that it's going to result in a reduction in staff. They're going to obviously have to raise their prices. I don't have all the stats right in front of me right now, but I know that 94% said it would have a huge negative impact on.
And what about, have your members raised any issues around CPC contributions?
Well, you know we're getting a lot of feedback about the ORPP in Ontario. There's huge concern about the impact that will have on jobs going forward. And yes, we are a very labor-intensive business. Food and labor account for the lion's share of our operating expenses. So when labor costs increase, and we're also a very small margin industry. So when labor costs increase significantly, it always has an impact on our ability to provide hours and jobs.
Interrupt, but it would be best if we could stay as close to possible to the Federal Budget Implementation Act, because that's what we're here to discuss.
Okay. One of the things in the Federal Budget Act is the Canada Summer Jobs Program. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
What is there much take-up on this program within your industry?
Yes, there is take-up on the program, and I'm sorry I don't have stats on that, but I know that it is a program that is used by our members in different parts of the country.
Just a couple of questions. to the Ms. McEwen. I think we had discussions previously. I think you made a presentation prior to the budget. In the I know you'd made some comments in your opening remarks today relative to the recommending the private-public partnership. I think I can't remember the exact terminology for it, but anyway, it's basically the P3 initiative by the federal government. What basis do you have to make the comments that say that the P3 process is more expensive? Because I think both federally and provincially in the country, we've had good indications that in certain projects, not all of them, but in certain areas, that P3s work very well.
Actually, the research shows in Ontario, the Auditor General did a report showing that it's more expensive and that the risk stays in the public sector rather than we're sold is that the risk is privatized. So the profits are privatized and the risk remains in the public sector. And also in Saskatchewan, the Auditor General showed that that was the outcome of what has actually taken place. Now, you could possibly design a system that didn't operate that way, but that's not what we've had. So that's why we're calling for a transparency.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leipert. Mr. Caron.
Merci beaucoup. Merci aux témoins. J'ai plusieurs questions.
Thank you. Thank you to the witnesses. I only have 7 minutes, so I have 4 questions to 4 different witnesses in order to cover what I want to cover. Ms. Eng, Mr. John, thank you for being on the committee. Ms. Eng, we've worked together closely in the past. My first question is for changes with regard to the OAS or the GIs are only going to apply in July. And so they're going to be retroactively applied to January 1st. Do you have any concerns about the date? You mentioned your concerns with regard to the amounts and some who are excluded. Would you talk a little bit about that? My second question, in addition to that, is this one. Do you consider that you have a very high number of elderly who live in poverty after these changes have been applied? Do you have an estimated number to provide to us?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Today, using the low-income measure, there are about over 600,000 Canadian seniors living in poverty. And despite the poverty line is different for each geographic region. And it's not to say that all those who are living in poverty are just under the poverty line. Rather, many are, in the mean, which sometimes in the range of $9,000 a year. So this is clearly not enough for people to live on. And when they live in poverty, it's severe poverty. The amounts that are in the budget today and the other hope for improvements to housing and so on will, of course, make a difference. Excuse me. And in fact, the increases to GIS are supposed to help 900,000 seniors, which is also commendable. But does that lift every one of them out of poverty? The answer is no. The exact amount that is necessary has not been identified, but the fact remains that that's not enough to reach the actual goal that we should be reaching for, and that is to make sure that no senior is living in poverty in Canada. So obviously, the patchwork that we have, while welcome, needs to be improved. So we can improve within the context of this committee's mandate to increase the amount on one hand, increase the date or broaden the date on which it happens.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur.
Thank you. Mr. Parent, a quick question for you. You talked about the difficulty of evaluating the compensatory measures in the Act. You know that the bill was separated previously under the title of C12, which has now been integrated into C15. And this is the kind of question that might have been asked previously, for which we might have received answers from experts in committee, because this would have gone to the Veterans Committee previously. Those who might have attended the committee meeting and the general comments that they might have put forward based on a specific study before that committee, rather than putting in an omnibus bill, you're talking about we're dealing with all kinds of people here, retired people, restaurant people, venture capital. Thank you for the question. It's important to understand that all measures taken by the previous government, as well as the new one, are shrinking, if you will, the negative consequences. The experts that might have been consulted might have established objectives and targets, because often what we're looking at now in the budget are corrective measures that are undertaken to fill in the shortcomings or overcome shortcomings. These things weren't necessarily planned for, though. Often the benefits were introduced over the course of several years, and that they were mixed up. And, you know, we don't necessarily have a common objective of establishing what we want for our veterans. What is the main goal? Do we want them to get to the poverty threshold, or we want them beyond that? So the same thing, these things have never been discussed, and these are the things that the committee would benefit from if we were truly able to provide a better lens to determine where the needs are for veterans and their families. And we can't do this because this bill was integrated into a bill that included 35 other acts. Ms. McEwen, very quickly, in a few minutes, we talked about asset recycling. You had also talked about P3s. Is there a link to be made between those two? And what do you estimate is the impact would be for privatization in the government's present plans? In your estimation, what would that be?
Right. So what our research shows is that asset recycling is very often used in order to privatize. It's kind of a backdoor to privatization. And it's sold as something to increase efficiencies, that we would sell something that has a revenue stream, we sell that to the private sector, and then we get more money to make more investments. But very often, the theory behind that is that the private sector can do it more efficiently. The way that the private sector does things more efficiently is that they lower wages and benefits to workers, or they add fees for users. So either we're not getting the service that we need, or the workers aren't getting a fair shot. And so we think that it's better to find other ways to raise money to invest in the public infrastructure that we need. There's no such thing as a free lunch. This seems like too good to be true, right? So it is.
Merci beaucoup. Une dernière question au Fonds de solidarité.
Thank you very much. One last question to the Fonds de Solidarité. We worked together when the tax credit was eliminated. So with regard to the tax credit for venture capitals, they're ineffective with regard to performance, and so the fund contributed to this inefficiency. Can you talk about the performance rate and the work has been done on behalf of shareholders in the last 3 years or the past 5 years in your fund? Thank you for this question, and it allows me to underline the double mission of our fund and fiscalized funds. You know, we can invest in Canadian funds as well as businesses, but the other part of our mission is to stimulate saving, encourage and promote saving, and we do this with our shareholders who are part of the middle class. You know, on average, they save $2,500, and so we have to give them a good performance, and our performance in the past couple of years has been 6.1, 7.3% over 3 years, and so since the creation of our fund in 1983, so 4% return on investment. Thank you very much. Thank you.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for our panel for their patience this morning as well. I could probably speak to each individual member and have questions and stuff, but I would like to focus my remarks with Mr. Ghilamberti from the Steel Association. On a personal level, my riding president is a member of the Canadian, the buyer side, and another good family friend have their own steel company in Brampton, actually. And I was speaking to him, the first individual, who is a buyer of steel, and I asked him this morning, are the Chinese dumping steel? And his comment was, in 2 words, big time. And he gave me an example. For example, there are 30,000 tons of steel destined for our largest trading partner, the United States. The U.S. put duties on steel, so the steel came to Canada and was sitting on our docks. Then, the internal price for steel was around $50 CWT versus what this steel was selling at, which roughly went from 18, then there was some upward price pressure, to the mid-30s. So I do get it. I do understand it. The jobs that are generated by all the steel industry and the ecosystem around it are well-paying, good benefits, highly skilled, advanced manufacturing, and we need to protect this industry. We know that there are steel producers in the world where there is overcapacity and they're dumping steel, and we know that the steel producers in Canada and the whole ecosystem is much more environmentally friendly than the steel industry back in some of the Asian countries, and China specifically. Within Bill C-15, there is Part 4, Division 10 on the Special Import Measures Act. I take it, Joseph, you're familiar with that?
Yes.
And I wanted to get your comments on Part 1 and Part 2 on the amendments that we have offered in our bill and how potentially beneficial or significant they can be to the steel industry.
Yeah, sure. I guess just first to touch on the point that you were making around the prevalence of dumping, we know that it's going on. Our producers are very, very aware of it. To give you a particularly prescient example, I get all kinds of solicitations to buy Chinese steel in my email box. I get about 5-6 a week. It's not particularly sophisticated, but the solicitations come in. I followed up on, and I'll give you a really recent example because every once in a while will offer it or will suggest, I might be interested in buying steel just out of pure personal curiosity. The willingness on the other end of the email to tell you how to circumvent existing duties, to import product through third countries to get around even the laws that we have in this country or the measures that we currently have in this country, it is extraordinarily easy to find. And I give domestic buyers a lot of credit for staying with domestic producers, because there are, if you're willing to overlook just terrible practice, there are other options out there. The steps proposed in this bill are certainly meaningful. The continuance of investigation, no more sort of parking investigations at the preliminary stage, giving CBSA more time to get to the bottom of what's going on, extraordinarily important from our perspective. The changes around the process of expiry reviews that ultimately sort of move the review, the initiation of the review closer to the date of the expiration, change some timelines and redefine some process, ultimately means that, when the CITT, the Canadian International Trade Tribunal, makes a finding, this will functionally extend that finding, that evidence-based, procedural-based finding, for 10 months. The ongoing consultation on another, sort of range of issues, we hope is going to provide additional legislative benefit very shortly. We appreciate that the Department of Finance needs to consult on these matters. That consultation is scheduled to end around the end of June. We're hopeful of additional legislation shortly thereafter to continue keeping us on a level footing with our NAFTA partners.
Yeah, because on a personal level, as an economist by training, I do believe in the benefits of free trade. I do think it's obviously been beneficial to our economy. We are an open economy, we're a trading economy, but also I'm very acutely aware of practices that are poor for the environment and poor for our domestic industry. And I know whatever it's a normative judgment or whatever word you want to describe, but I think in this case here, we must act like our U.S. partners and not be the Boy Scouts of the world. These are, thousands of jobs are dependent in various industries across Ontario and riding I belong to, and we need to make sure that we're standing up for them. And I think these amendments here are a big step forward.
And you make an excellent point about fair trade and free trade. All of the measures that are proposed here, we believe, are WTO compliant. This is really about a level global playing field. We're talking about the prevention of dumping and subsidy. We're not talking about the prevention of fairly traded good.
Mr. Chair, how long do I have?
I get about a minute left.
Okay, I'm going to ask Mr.
Okay.
Oh, who am I? Mr. McKinnon. I'm going to give the last minute of my time to Mr. McKinnon. Thank you.
Merci, mon collègue. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you to my colleague, and thank you to the chair. My question is for the Fonds de Solidarité et Travail. Thank you for being here with us today. We're very pleased to make the appropriate changes in this budget. At this committee, we also discuss labor-sponsored venture capital funds and the venture funds in Canada in general. Could you briefly describe, because we have very little time left, your role in Quebec in the venture capital network, and perhaps enlighten us as to success stories that you would like to communicate to us? In Quebec and in Canada, we do this in two ways. Over the last 10 years, we invested $2 billion in venture capital. This was done indirectly by investing into funds. I'll give you Lumila Capital, which is a fund based in Toronto in biotechnology and sciences. There's also Lead Order. Even in difficult moments, we've always been there. We've been very aware and participative in this sector. This is important for Quebec and Canada. When it comes to Lumira, we invested $35 million in a fund of $125 million. We were lead order. Lumira will tell you, without our investment, they would not have been able to achieve the rate of $125 million in their fund. Lumira later invested about $25 million in Zymeworks, based in Vancouver, which works in the field of cancer research. So you can see that we also invest directly in Lumira, and then you can see that it had spin-off effects. We've got a spin-off effect of 5 to 1 or 4 to 1. We've also done directly in the field of science over the last 20 years. The Fonds de Solidarité was one of the investors in biopharma, which discovered a medicine against HIV, which saved hundreds of millions of lives around the world. Since then, with our success in biochemistry, we continue to invest in this sector and continue to invest over the last 20 years about $950 million in the sector. There are many other good examples that we could give you to explain how we've been able to help move forward the biotech industry in Canada in collaboration with funds in Vancouver and so on. $2 billion. I don't know a lot of institutional investors who have invested $2 billion in capital in venture capital over the last 10 years.
Moran, we have, just for witnesses who came in for 12:30, we had, due to the vote, decided to extend this session till 1. Mr. Abutov.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all the panelists here. First question to Ms. Reynolds. I was a restaurant owner more than once in my life. Last year, 2015, before the election. And I see the two things that impact in the industry, I guess, are the CPP premium and the employment insurance increases right there. Can you please tell us a little bit on the impact of these on business ownership? The restaurant industry is very, very fragile, I call it, because one of the businesses that can be exposed to close down in a matter of time because of the low profits or no profits, running around the clock to see if you can find a balance to make money. So can you tell us what the impact is going to be on the amount of restaurants you have, we have in Canada, and how that's going to impact the industry at large?
Yeah. Well, payroll taxes tend to have the biggest impact on a restaurant business because we're so labor intensive. And as I mentioned before, we're #1 first-time job provider. We have about 25% of our workforce are under the age of 25. And payroll taxes, in a sense, are regressive because you pay disproportionately more for when you've got entry-level workers at a starting wage. So it does have a very detrimental effect on businesses. And that's why we are very supportive of the year's basic exemption in the Canada Pension Plan, which helps to make CPP a little bit more progressive. And what we are looking for in terms of CPP is that the inflation protection be restored to that $3,500, and that a similar type of year's basic exemption be part of the EI, so that it isn't youth who are losing out on those, foundational skills that they get in the first job, and they're not reaching the age of 28 without ever having held a single job, and the opportunity to progress within the labor force and and having that all important experience on their resume so that they can increase their earning power at a later date. So yes, all of those, for all those reasons, payroll taxes have a very big impact.
Well, thank you. Question to Mrs. McEwen, I believe. And I mean, historically, we know in business that private-public partnership, or the 3Ps or the P3, whatever you want to call them, governments, when they do their investments or they take care on projects on their own using public money, the experience in the past seems to be unsuccessful because governments should not be in business. In most governments should be in legislation and making the rules and putting the proper rules. Now, don't you believe that where we fail in the P3, as you mentioned in some reports from Ontario and other staff, are related to government negotiation with the private sector rather than with the business model?
No. There are public services that can be efficiently and effectively provided by the public sector. The private sector is not necessarily better at providing those services because those services don't necessarily generate a profit, which is what the private sector is interested in. Those services serve the welfare of the society as a whole. So I'm talking about services that businesses benefit from, having efficient water, roads, electricity, having education, having health care, all publicly provided. You get a better service, and it's more efficient if it's the public sector that's providing it. And the research shows that to be the case.
Well, I have to disagree.
You can disagree, but you're wrong.
I want to disagree, and I just don't want to turn this into a debate. The thing is that you talk about raising money, okay? Where the government is going to raise money to fund such projects, and that means going back to taxpayers to ask for more money. So instead of using private sector's money that can be negotiated upfront, at least you know that your costs are fixed, and then you know that you don't have to go into non-anticipated or some surprises down the road. So that's exactly where I see this, and I believe with better negotiation, governments can get better deal for the people without having to go into the public treasury and pull some money from the taxpayers' money.
Give a quick response. Go ahead.
Absolutely. I think that taxes are the price that we pay for a fair society and for a healthy society. Gosh. And if we have progressive, fair, transparent taxes, we all benefit from that. And we can always borrow. Borrowing costs are really low right now.
Mr. Graywell.
To all our witnesses for coming today. My questions are to Ms. McEwen. You spoke about infrastructure funding, so you'll be happy to know that we have repealed the public-private partnership screen on the Building Canada Fund, so a little bit of good news to start off the questions. In your press release on Budget 2016, you mentioned that the National Framework on Early Learning and Childcare, for which the budget sets aside $400 million, I want to know if your organization has does have a framework for how we're going to spend this money, or have done research in this area?
So we have worked with a coalition of childcare workers and providers, and that coalition has a framework. Yes, so we've worked with people and where we think it would be best spent and how we would like to do that.
Can you get or send that document to the clerk so that we can have it for its review? And on the Court Challenges Program, so this was highlighted by your organization as an important service that was cut by the previous government. Can you explain how often or by how many Canadians this program on average was used? prior to being cut?
That's actually not my area of expertise. I'm sorry, I don't know.
Okay. Would you have
I
access?
do know that it's valuable, and I can send the committee a copy of our research on that.
Perfect. Thank you. And then my next question is mute based on that point because I was going to see the correlation of increasing the funding to see how much of it be over adopted. But if you could send us those statistics, that'd be great. Mr. Champagne? Mr. Chair, I will be giving Mr. Champagne some of my time, and if there's time left over, I'll come back to it.
It's one of these days where we have to eat, ask questions, and organize. So I apologize for that. And thank you all for your time to be present today. Mes premières questions iraient au fond de...
My first question is for the FTQ, or the Fonds de Solidarité. When we conducted our studies, we looked at the impact of the tax credit. How many workers benefit from your investment program? I think we're looking at about 600 million. What we want to understand is the impact for those who save, but also for the businesses that you invest in. A lot of discussion in the House surrounded supporting small and medium businesses. That is an issue which interests both sides of the House because the Canadian economy rests mostly on small and medium businesses. What do you do for those who save, for those who don't save? And what is your role in the world of investment and supporting small and medium businesses? We have a significant role of stimulating savings in the middle class, as I previously mentioned. Shareholders are not the rich and famous in our fund, they're middle class. Also, it's a matter of educating people and encouraging people to invest with an eye to the long-term, retirement. Many of our shareholders, we have 630 million shareholders, have often invested for the first time with us, and that's because of the education that we do among Quebecers with a network of volunteers all over Quebec. So we have a close relationship with our volunteers and shareholders and potential shareholders. We talk about the importance of working closely. It's important to educate, but at the end of the day, it's close contact between people that actually stimulates savings. And, as I also mentioned, people who contributed to an RSP for the very first time, I think it's about 60%, often contributed to another financial institution afterwards. So it was not only good for our fund, but it was good for encouraging Canadians to invest in other financial institutions with a view to retirement. When it comes to channeling investment, if we didn't have the tax credit to encourage people to save, the $250 million that we collect, I'm not sure it would be invested. We talked about venture capital before, and what we have in our studies is that people are more inclined to not necessarily save for retirement. We have to think about the importance of savings overall. So we have a tax credit to stimulate savings, but we also need to channel that towards businesses in Canada because we're responsible for some venture capital. If we looked at I think about 80% of our business partners benefited from an investment from our fund, and most of them are small and medium businesses with fewer than 100 employees. Our mission, our work, is to encourage investment in small and medium businesses. And they are a major engine for job creation in Canada.
Mr. Moran, Mr. Champagne, Mr. Coleman, floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. Ms. Nagar-Lamberti, I want to just go down the road a little bit more about your comment on overproduction and surplus, but first let me frame the question. About a week and a half ago on a weekend, I met with an owner of a local steel company in my riding, southwestern Ontario, and they employ just over 400 individuals in the and have very high wage, or very good wage structures, what you had mentioned. And he was expressing to me the fact, first of all, anecdotally, he said, we dealt with 4 other companies in the Cambridge area. I'm from Brantford, so this company's in Brantford. And he says, all those companies are gone. They're gone. And it leads to where I want to ask you what the prospects of the future are. He said that with the cost of electricity, they burn somewhere in the neighborhood of $80,000 a month worth of natural gas processing the steel, with a projected carbon tax that they're looking at costing, when they break it down by employee, about $9,000 more overhead a year per employee. And the prospect of additional payroll taxes because of what was mentioned by, I think, another witness, the Ontario retirement tax, or pension plan that is being put in place.
Coleman, this is on the federal budget.
I'm framing the question to a manufacturer who has to deal with
Seems to be on Ontario politics to me, but let's get to the Implementation Act.
I want to ask you in general terms, on the issue of overproduction and surplus that you brought up, and the issue that faces companies such as this in your industry, and the kind of directions that this implementation of these additional costs to businesses are going to put onto the actual businesses. What are you hearing, even if it's anecdotal, from the people you represent in the industry? What are you hearing about the prospect? Frankly, I walked away feeling rather depressed about the prospect for this company staying in Canada.
I don't want to minimize the challenges facing the domestic industry. We have a couple of our larger members are currently in CCAA processes. They're doing resale or restructuring it for sale. We are optimistic, or they have expressed optimism, that there are viable assets there, and these will be successful sale processes going forward, and they'll attract investment. I don't want to minimize the challenges also associated with things like the cap and trade program in Ontario, although there are, and I know this is a federal thing, but although there are allowances till the first compliance period in 2020, we don't have clarity beyond the first compliance period. We don't have clarity as to the pass-through of electricity. These are business uncertainties, and business does not like uncertainty for the purpose of investment. You talk about the importance of maintaining manufacturing in Canada. If we're going to achieve goals like GHG reduction, Canadian steel is much more environmentally friendly when used. When you're building something in Canada, using Canadian steel is a much more environmentally responsible way to go. We benefit from Ontario's green power grid in the province of Ontario specifically. These are all things that we need to preserve if we're going to help with global warming. This goes to what I was saying about the federal infrastructure program. We hope that Canadian companies have an opportunity to participate in this. It cannot be lowest common denominator sourcing. There should be a consideration if governments writ large are going to consider costs of carbon, are going to commoditize carbon for the purposes of cap and trade or carbon tax. They cannot simply then, when you're sourcing green infrastructure projects, go to a lowest common denominator procurement strategy. We hope that our producers are going to be able to participate. The amount of money is meaningful, and when you're looking at making an investment in this country, I believe that kind of a program colors it.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to go to Madam Reynolds. You had mentioned in your early in your comments that the tax system is overly complex. And of course, with the implementation bill, what we're doing is we're adding more and more complexity to the system because we're changing things and we're adding new requirements for restaurateurs and such in terms of payroll taxes that's been mentioned. In terms of the amount of cost to the average restaurateur as far as red tape, the things that they have to do to run their businesses and comply to government regulations, do you have any statistics regarding what the percentage of cost that is to their overhead, to their actual costs?
No, and it's cumulative because you have a lot at the municipal level, the local level, and then you have the provincial level, and then you have the federal level, and to try and some contradict what's required provincially contradicts what's required federally, and it varies from region to region. So it's really difficult to sort out. If there's any way that it can be simplified, and if there's help to operators in terms of interpreting what the requirements are, that's important. That's important as well.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. McCollum and Ms. O'Connell. We've got about 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for attending. Mr. Perron, I wanted to ask a question in regards to some of the changes you spoke about in your testimony. I was trying to look for the transcript from our meeting when we had officials testify, but I couldn't find them. They're not prepared yet. So I'm going to be paraphrasing a little bit, and I'm just wondering if you had watched the testimony from our officials, and if not, that's okay. Okay. So when we're talking about some of the changes like diminished earning capacity, things along this line, I know you mentioned in your testimony here today, it's a step in the right direction, but you're not quite sure how some of the implementation will be, and I get that. But from the officials, there was some discussion in regards to things like, case assessments, and with this new language, the opportunity to assess individual cases. Is that, and again, I'm paraphrasing because I couldn't find the exact wording, but is moving towards that type of case-by-case assessment now with the new language, is that what your organization and what you're hearing from veterans is looking towards?
Yes, a good point. And I think changing the language will facilitate access, assessment, determination, because in fact, one thing, the allowance was called permanent impairment allowance before, and it's now called career impact allowance. But yet when Bill C-55 introduced this particular benefit, it did say that it was to compensate for the capacity to earn, the loss of capacity to earn for retirement and to progress in the armed forces to the different rank structure. So it has nothing to do really with the impairment per se, but with the ability to earn. So I think going to that aspect of it, I think it's probably a lot easier too to interpret a situation in a case management context based on what is the capacity to earn rather than what is the physical deficiencies of the individual.
Great, thank you. When the testimony, the transcripts come out, I would encourage you to take a look to see if it is going in the direction your organization hopes.
Yes, thank you. I should correct that. I personally didn't watch the transcript, but my communication team has, and we certainly have that information.
Good, thank you very much. And then I don't have that much time, so I just want to move on to Ms. McEwen. You started to speak about if the PPP program were to be changed or improved. You talked about, and then your time ran out, but in terms of an independent or integrity, I don't know, you didn't finish your statement. Could you just maybe elaborate a little bit so I know what you were asking for?
Sure, and the Canadian Union of Public Employees has done a lot of work around this, and what we're asking for is comprehensive P3 accountability and transparency legislation.
Okay. Thank you. That was simple. Thank you. And then finally, because I know I'm running out of time, Mr. Gallimberti, I'm so sorry. I'm not good with names either. I understand the dumping of steel from Asian markets, in particular China. In my previous life as a municipal councillor, we actually heard some concerns from industry about that quality as well. Is that a concern? Notwithstanding, I've heard your presentation, I completely understand the issue. I don't want to move away from that issue, but should we also be worried that if this product is a steel product and once it's been changed from its original form, obviously, the integrity of it also changes? Is this a concern too, that if, let's say, an unsuspecting buyer doesn't realize they're not buying a domestic product and the quality and the assurances are not there. Is that also something that you're concerned about or that your organization is looking at, or are you mainly dealing on just the trade aspect?
Well, we're primarily focused on trade. But what I would say, I think there are enough actors and bad actors in the system that there is going to be an element of product that arrives here that is probably not going to be satisfactory. I mean, I'd certainly leave that with the sort of building code folks or the industries that end up the end users of this. I can speak to the domestic product, which is an extraordinarily high quality product, which is, you know, extensively monitored and tested, tremendous investment.
Thank you.
You know, whatever is arriving on imports.
Great. Thank you.
We will cut it there, and I will thank the witnesses. I would, I believe, Ms. Reynolds, you were going to provide a paper due to a question on this side.
I'm going to have our economist look into it, see what he can do.
And Mr. Galimberti, I would say, based on the discussion between Mr. McCollum and yourself, you are aware we will be holding pre-budget hearings in the fall. We hope that may be along the lines of what do you do to what negative things impact growth and what positive things would improve growth. You might want to keep that in mind for fall. And Ms. McEwen, I think there was a couple of documents asked to you. Thank you very much all for your presentations, and we'll suspend for a couple of minutes while the next series of witnesses come up. ask witnesses to come to the table and members as well. We'll have to leave 10 minutes at the end of this session for business, for the business of committee. Starting in this session, we have the Canadian Teachers Federation, PI Coalition for Fair EI, and the Conference Board of Canada. Starting with Ms. Smith with the Canadian Teachers Federation, you have 5 minutes. Ms. Smith and Mr. McGahey.
All right, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to address you regarding Bill C-15. My name is Heather Smith, and I am president of the Canadian Teachers Federation. With me here today is Bob McGahey, CTF Director of Advocacy and Labour Rights. And after our comments, we do have a written brief that expands on the points that we're going to make. CTF is a bilingual, non-partisan alliance of provincial and territorial teachers' organizations in Canada. We represent over 200,000 teachers, and that number is growing. As a unified voice of teacher organizations in Canada on education and related social issues, we promote high-quality public education, the status of the teaching profession, and the freedom to learn. The CTF is on record as being generally pleased with the progressive nature of the most recent federal budget. Teachers do, however, have some concerns about specific initiatives, and especially as they relate to the improvement of mental health for students and teachers, the need for education to be a priority for the government's overseas development assistance, and the alleviation of child poverty. We believe these issues should be government priorities. Our work today focus on the alleviation, our comments today focus on the alleviation of child poverty, and we look forward to future opportunities to comment more broadly on some of our other issues. Turning to the child tax benefit, the alleviation of child poverty is of critical importance to teachers. Each day in our classrooms, Canadian teachers engage with children and youth who are hungry, tired, and struggling due to poverty. The Canadian Child Benefit Program is a good first step towards alleviating child poverty. We agree with the rationale of the Dignity for All campaign's national anti-poverty plan that calls for strong federal leadership in reducing and ultimately eliminating poverty. And while the Canadian Teachers Federation commends the government for taking action, we believe that there's more that needs to be done. With regard to the Canada Child Benefit, we recommend that 1, provisions be put in place to ensure the benefit is indexed to inflation, and 2, the Government of Canada enter into agreements with provinces and territories to ensure the benefit does not adversely affect entitlement to other social assistance programs. I'll only briefly mention employment insurance, as I believe colleagues from the Canadian Labour Congress have expanded on this, and more information is contained in our brief. Our recommendations are, though, that categories of workers be eliminated from the EI program and all workers be treated equally under the system, and that claimants be provided with a choice regarding the duration of the waiting period so that they may choose to waive the waiting period entirely, take a 1-week waiting period, or take the 2-week waiting period. Lastly, I want to focus on the school supplies tax credit. First, a bit of context. The Canadian Teachers Federation firmly believes governments have a responsibility to fully fund the education system so that all children and youth have access to an equitable, quality, publicly funded public education. Teachers should not have to subsidize the system. Yet, we know that chronic underfunding has led to a situation in which teachers are spending significant amounts of money to support student learning. A 2010 CTF national study confirmed out-of-pocket expenditures by educators for classroom materials or class-related activities averaged $453 per educator, and that figure is increasing. Given that teachers have been subsidizing the education system for years now, The CTF does appreciate that teachers will now be reimbursed for at least some of their out-of-pocket expenses. To improve the credit, however, the CTF has two main suggestions. The first, that C15 be amended to remove the requirements of a written certificate from employers. This change would recognize the professional judgment of teachers who are in the best position to determine what needs to be purchased. It would also prevent the potential blurring of this credit with other taxation provisions provided to goods required as conditions of employment. And our second suggestion is that the list of prescribed items in Bill C-15 be amended to include a subsection E stating other non-consumable educational resources. We suggest this addition as we do not believe it's possible or helpful to enumerate an exhaustive list of the non-consumable items a professional teacher may deem necessary to support student learning in the diverse K-12 classrooms across our country. Thank you for your attention, and I welcome your further questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Smith. Turning to Ms. McKay, PEI Coalition for Fair EI. Welcome.
Thanks.
Always good to have another Islander in Ottawa.
Of course. The PEI Coalition for Fair EI would like to thank the members of the committee for hearing from us. I am pleased to be able to appear before you on behalf of the coalition. We formed this coalition, community groups, citizens, and unions, as a response to the 2012 changes to the Employment Insurance Program by the previous government. The 2012 changes were incredibly punitive to workers in the seasonal industries in Prince Edward Island and largely still remain after Bill C-15 was introduced. Some improvements were made, but very little for seasonal industries. The PEI Coalition continues to call on the Liberal government to fulfill its election promise to completely reverse all of the 2012 EI changes, as this has not been done despite the Minister of Labour's comments in the House of Commons. We welcome the changes to reduce entrance hours and the reduction of 1 week waiting period for some EI recipients that was announced in Bill C-15, but they do little to help seasonal workers. The reduction of 1 week waiting period will certainly help to get much-needed funds into the hands of unemployed workers who do not use their full number of weeks of benefit. However, it is not helpful for the many seasonal workers in Prince Edward Island who do not have enough insurance to last their entire period of unemployment, especially since 2012. So this change just means they will run out of benefit 1 week sooner. Bill C-15's response to the downturn in the oil industry by giving additional 5 weeks to regions with an increase of 2% unemployment in the last year certainly helps some workers, but definitely not all that are affected, and it creates an unfair gap. The budget completely ignores PEI and our neighbouring provinces, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, who lost the additional 5 weeks in 2012. Despite the fact that PEI has 11.5% unemployment rate, second highest in the country, and up 1% from last year in April, this budget bill did not return the 5 weeks lost, and now the many displaced oil workers from Prince Edward Island are returning home without the 5 additional weeks that their co-workers are receiving, despite the fact that they are returning to areas of higher unemployment and access to fewer jobs, unless, of course, they're returning to Newfoundland. As important as the need to return the 5 weeks of additional benefit to our province is the need to immediately remove the additional zone for Prince Edward Island. PEI was always considered one economic zone for the purposes of EI for a reason. Despite the fact that PEI has 2 cities, with our population size of only 146,000, we are really a rural economy when it comes to jobs. There is not a large industry that gives much more access to jobs in one part of the province than another, but in February 2014, our province was divided into 2 zones, urban and rural. This meant that those living in the urban zone had far fewer weeks and less benefits than those in the rural zone, despite the fact that the folks living in the urban zone do not have access to more jobs. The map used to divide our island makes absolutely no sense. 2 cities in PEI with federal government jobs in both, 1 city considered urban, the other city rural. I will use an example of an area that our chair knows very well. One small fishing community, North Rustico, located very close to the tourist area of Cavendish, is located in rural Prince Edward Island, but its neighbour, very close, 4 kilometres away thereabouts, Mayfield, with many workers from the fishing industry and the tourist industry, and farther from the city of Charlottetown, is considered urban. Workers working side by side in jobs making the same money for the same number of weeks getting treated very differently when it comes to EI benefits. The new zone on PEI must be removed immediately because it doesn't work and it pits Islander against Islander. To conclude my opening remarks, seasonal workers have been unfairly treated by the last government, and C-15 does little to rectify this situation. We need a job strategy in this country that recognizes that some industries are seasonal, but workers want full-time, year-round work. Finally, the planned reduction of EI premiums must be stopped. The experience of the sudden downturn in the oil industry and the natural disaster of the wildfires in Fort McMurray highlights the extreme importance of a fully funded EI program for our capitalist economy. I will be happy to answer any questions the committee members might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. McKay. Mr. Hodgin, with the Conference Board of Canada. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, committee members. Nice to be back again. I thought I could most add value to the committee's hearings by talking about things from a macro perspective and linking the budget to economic growth. And I've got 4 points I want to make in that front. First of all, Canadian growth remains anemic. That's the nicest word I can come up with. Alberta is in a recession, which will probably be a little bit worse in the near term thanks to the Fort McMurray fires, maybe a little bit better towards the back end of the year. Newfoundland is also flirting with recession, Saskatchewan growing fairly weakly, but there are some pockets of stronger growth. BC will probably have growth of around 2.7% this year. Ontario, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia are the 4 provinces we list as a strong growth area. So you get a very uneven story across the country. The single most depressing variable in our forecast is private investment growth, which we see contracting for the 2nd consecutive year. And in fact, our capital base at the end of this year, private sector, may be smaller than it was 3 years ago. And that's a concern for ongoing growth, for productivity, for competitiveness for our economies. I'll come back to that. Secondly, I think I said in the pre-budget period that some rebalancing of macroeconomic policy was warranted. Most macroeconomists agreed. In fact, the Bank of Canada said that it was probably time for the fiscal authorities to step up a bit because we were effectively pushing on a string. So the rebalancing that's gone on the last 6 months was generally supported by macroeconomists, people in my field. On the budget itself, our estimate is that the budget will add a little bit to growth both this year and next year. We had actually anticipated certain actions in our pre-budget forecast. So we've added 0.2% to growth this year, 0.1% to growth next year, but the growth effect fades. And in fact, it's really important to note that you can only stimulate for so long through fiscal deficits because the effect does fade after 2 or 3 years. I'd also frankly commend Minister Morneau. The budget is based on really prudent assumptions. I know he's been criticized by some. There's some who think that, for example, the deficit may end up being much smaller than was forecast. But given the uncertainty with things like oil prices, not knowing where inflation's going, I've advised finance ministers for about a decade now to be prudent in your assumptions. And if you're going to surprise people, surprise them the upside. So I actually like prudent assumptions building contingency into the budget. And if we end up with having a deficit which is only half the size, I think that's actually good news. It means we have to borrow half so much on a going forward basis. The real issue for me is the long term. And I do think the federal budget has to get re-anchored at some point for fiscal credibility, for credible management. That's certainly the advice I gave to Minister Morneau, is that I would like to see what your plan is in year 3, 4, 5 for the debt-GDP ratio. We don't automatically have to go back to balanced budgets, but I do think over time you've got to be aware about what your stock of debt is and how you're managing that, because there is an opportunity cost to running deficits year after year. I mean, federal government will spend about $27 billion this year on interest alone. That's 9% of the federal budget. And the more you run deficits, the more debt you'll have to build up, and the more you're going to squeeze out other programs. And that's really the fundamental economic reason for having kind of a long-term plan for your fiscal strategy. And on growth itself, we think 2% is now the new normal for Canada. In fact, 2% growth would be a good year based on what's happened the last 3 or 4 years. There's no easy path to stronger growth. Infrastructure investment, we think, is a really important element, but it should complement, not be a substitute for private investment. I mentioned earlier that we're troubled by the private investment growth numbers that we're seeing. Infrastructure investment by the public sector can fill in for a while, but it can't fill in forever. It really has to build a foundation for stronger private growth, private investment growth going forward. I do think there's scope for rethinking our tax system and for tax reform. And Mr. Chairman, I've noticed your comments in the media about tax reform. I think you and I are on the same page, that it probably is time to have a rethink of our tax system and see whether we can do things that will actually strengthen the growth potential of our economy. I'd happy to talk about that if you're interested. Free trade agreements also add a little bit to our growth potential. It's a small amount, but I do think in our long-term interests, we have to find ways to reach out and connect with the rest of the global economy. And of course, things like innovation strategies will be part of a growth plan. But ultimately, we need a private investment and also stronger productivity growth if we're to have stronger economic growth down the road. And I'll offer that as my opening comments.
Thank you very much. Turning to questions, and we'll go to 5 instead of 7, starting with Mr. McKinnon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Welcome to you all.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Record, Mr. Easter is not the only Islander in the room.
There's 3.
My first question is to Ms. Smith, and thank you, Mr. McGahey and Ms. Smith, for coming. And I would like you to expand on your comments, particularly in respect of child poverty. I know we're very proud of the new Canada Child Benefit and the fact that it will take several 100,000 children out of poverty in Canada, and our government's role in doing that. Can you just perhaps comment on what teachers, what are the positive effects on learning for children entering the classroom, whether from a nutrition point of view, from a cognitive point of view, and others, when you see children emerging from poverty?
Well, I can tell you that I was a teaching principal actually in New Brunswick, in rural New Brunswick, until June of 2015. So I know very well the effects of poverty on child's learning. When you have children arriving at school without having had breakfast, or perhaps not a healthy supper the night before, their last thoughts are learning. Their thoughts are food, and your brain just does not work properly if it's not been had sufficient sustenance. So I know in our school and in many schools, there are breakfast programs. There are schools who are fundraising in order to have enough, or applying for grants that will supplement any provincial budget that they may have for food. They're providing breakfast. We're providing lunches. We're ensuring that kids do not go hungry, or we're hoping to. There are even places where children are given backpacks of food to take home for the weekend. And schools are doing that, and community groups are doing that, because we know the importance of food on learning. Your brain just doesn't work properly unless you do. And the thoughts of a child are not on what the task is at hand. It's on their belly that's rumbling.
As a long-term economic growth strategy, it sounds like a pretty good one.
Well, it certainly does, and I mean, I think if we're not going to put our support behind our youth, then the future of our country is certainly in jeopardy.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Hodgson. Turning to you, this committee, I think, always appreciates your insights and advice, and I know that. As we debate both C-15 and subsequent years, subsequent budgets, and economic strategies for the country, a number of us feel that there are a couple of ways which we can contribute, and you touched on a couple of them. You speak of the new normal of anemic growth, and also of taxation and the need for tax reform in the country. And they converge in this way, and I'd like you to expand on this if you might. What are the regulatory, institutional, fiscal, or other impediments to growth in the country, and how might we rearrange those tools, perhaps lighten the load in terms of regulation or taxation in order to achieve or accelerate growth beyond this new normal?
Well, I think for today's purposes, I'll touch on two things. The mandate of this committee is to examine all things fiscal, so let's talk a bit about tax. Are we taxing the right things as a starting point? Economists would prefer to tax consumption rather than taxing work effort or investment, for example. We built up a huge array of tax expenditures. And Mr. Chairman, I mentioned last time of $100 billion leakage, and then the Department of Finance put out a paper 3 days later confirming this about $100 billion of leakage. That's a lot of lost revenue that could be directed towards lower tax rates, for example, or a smarter tax system. I believe that we should be taxing carbon, for example, and there's a question about whether the federal government, in addition to the 3 provinces, soon to be 4, that are doing that, should be trying to shift the balance in our economy towards a lower carbon economy down the road. So I think there's a lot of scope to rethink the tax system in its entirety, or piece by piece, but we built it up piece by piece. Maybe this is the time to take a wide view. I'll pick up your prompt. I do think there are things we could do to reduce barriers within the country to interprovincial mobility of goods, capital, ideas. The past government actually took this on. I think that there's more to do. So anything we could do to ensure that we have a single Canadian market, a national federation, by reducing often really subtle regulatory barriers between sectors and regions would be a step ahead. I've spent most of my 12 years at the Conference Board trying to think about what a national growth strategy would look like, and those are just 2 examples.
That's it.
We're out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McKinnon, Mr. Hodgin. Mr. Abultov.
And I have a question for Ms. Smith, I believe, on have you run the calculation on the difference between the old child benefits program and the new one, how much that difference is?
I'm going to pass that one to Mr. McGaughey.
Should I repeat?
Nope.
No, thanks. We've been relying on the publications of the CLC and the Canadian Child Care Advocacy Organization to do those calculations, and we're of the opinion that it is going to be a net benefit to families and children in Canada for the most part. However, we're also of the belief that this is only one piece of a comprehensive anti-poverty plan that needs to be put in place to fully address the problem. The previous question about food, for example, we're one of the few, if not the only OECD countries that does not have a national food program for schools. So if that money didn't have to be used exclusively for that because those people in poverty could get a meal at school, then you see it's part of an integrated program, a national plan that has to be developed.
No, just your information, the difference is $1 billion, equal to $27.77 per capita based on 36 million population in Canada. So I don't know where that is and how much this is going to help pull in 9 out of 10 or hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. So that just for records, just to show that here, and I'd like to make this point to you. Looking at another mention about about $453 out of pocket by almost an average by teacher. You've got 200,000 teachers and your organization. That's probably about $90 million a year. I hope those numbers. I hope those numbers are not really there, because it's really concerning if that's the case. And where is in the budget that to help on that front? If you can explain that.
Thank you. Just to clarify, you mentioned $27 per capita. That's an average?
27.77.
That's an average?
Yeah. If you divide $1 billion.
So as you may know, the same with the expenditures for teachers. Those expenditures range from $200 to up to $2,000 per teacher that are spending in the classrooms. True. And that is, so it averages down. In the same way as the benefit is going to benefit those who are in the lower income percentiles more than it's going to benefit those in the higher. But to get to the teacher tax credit, that is, or the amount that teachers are paying, that is, and the number of teachers in Canada is closer to 300,000 or maybe more than that. So it ranges between that low of about $200 per teacher to a high of up to $2,000. And the high tend to be unfortunately, those younger teachers who are just starting and just setting up their first classroom who are making the least amount of money.
Okay. Are you aware of the elimination of the textbook tax credits? Can you explain that? And again, that's taking away something from students, from parents, on this front. That's really putting a levy on every Canadian family.
You mean a university textbook credit?
Yes.
Yeah, well, we're K-12 education, but I can comment as a parent of a student in a university. Yes,
Well,
I'm aware.
Okay. What do you think of that? I mean, is that the right move?
Well, I mean, I can't comment on that in my role as president, as my role as a parent. Yes, I'll see the difference in my tax next year.
So we'll be looking for results next year, see the impact, how it's going to be? Okay. How much time do we have?
Time for one quick question.
Okay, quick question on the, I believe, for Mr. Hudson. The budget includes a projection of 1% GDP growth, and the baseline numbers will also include a unilateral decision by the finance minister to downgrade private sector GDP forecast by $40 billion. Are these numbers credible?
Well, those are really the bottom end of the range. I mean, I have the privilege of being part of the circle of economists who give advice directly to finance ministers, and I told Mr. Morneau that he was my 11th minister in my career. But I was surprised, in fact, by how cautious some of my colleagues were with their forecasts. We were actually at the higher end of the range, so a real economic growth forecast around 1% wasn't that far below the bottom of the band. It was kind of forming the bottom of the band. I do think it's prudent to build some contingency into budgets on a going forward basis. Historically, finance ministers have often had a sort of a contingency reserve of between $3 and $5 billion on a budget of $275 or $280 billion spending. That's a very, very thin margin. When you can't control revenues, federal government can control spending. It can't control revenue. That's really very much driven by the growth path of the economy. So as a matter of good practice, I think building a bigger contingency in is the prudent thing to do. How you do it is open for debate. I would probably have advised to put it right into the budget as a reserve. But Mr. Morneau chose to be prudent, and I have a hard time taking exception with that.
Thank you both. Mr. Caron.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'll start with Ms. McKay. I was very pleased that you talked about seasonal workers in the Atlantic region and in certain regions of Quebec, and notably the one that I represent. It's a reality. Seasonal jobs are a significant part of the economy. Before 2012, there was a measure, a pilot project, that extended the benefit period by 5 weeks in regions where there was a high unemployment rate, which were often regions that depended on seasonal jobs. It was abolished by the Conservatives, and now we have a black hole. The period between the end of benefits and the beginning of seasonal work, which can be as long as 3 months. Now, we're back to an extension of 5 weeks of benefits, but only for some regions, which don't necessarily have the highest unemployment rates, but who have seen an increase, which leaves behind just about everyone in the Atlantic provinces and Quebec, which focuses on 12 to 15 regions in Canada. What can this bill really do for seasonal workers, and what could have been done for seasonal workers in terms of concretely dealing with their reality?
Well, obviously repealing all of the 2012 changes would help seasonal workers, because almost every aspect of those changes are a tax on seasonal workers. When you talk about the 5-week hole, the black hole that exists now in the Atlantic and a lot of seasonal areas, and I want to also comment that seasonal work is happening all across this country, and it's actually in cities now, because what we're creating in this country for jobs are precarious part-time work. So seasonal workers are everywhere, but they're predominantly in areas where, you know, seasonal industries are, with the weather, we can't pulled potatoes out of the ground in January. So that the reversal, we also need to reverse the classifications of workers, the categories of workers, because that actually enhanced the black hole. So we lost the 5 weeks, but if you're a worker that is seasonal, so you've accessed EI a number of times, you actually lose benefit each and every year that you actually go back to EI. So your black hole is increasing. So we need to repeal that, most certainly. The working while on claim, apparently the budget is going to address the fact that people could actually opt back into the old working while on claim. We're concerned that the eligibility requirements around that are still in place, so we have to make sure that those eligibility requirements are removed so that people will actually be able to opt in. And I'll tell you, in a seasonal industry, I'll use the mussel industry for an example, there's 1 day of work weekly through the winter season because they can harvest mussels on the ice. You can't, there's not a week's full of work, it's 1 day. So that's why the working while on claim in the old system for the seasonal industries is so very important. The other part is the best 14 weeks, a pilot project that needs to be put back in, and that was just basically deciding what the benefit is in the areas, and it's because of the precariousness of the work. And again, what I want to stress is that I'm speaking from PEI's perspective because that's where I come from, but this is a seasonal industries issue is straight across this country, and it's in rural Quebec, it's in rural Ontario, it's in rural Manitoba, it's in rural Alberta, it's in rural BC. It's everywhere, and it's in the urban area as well.
You talked about the mussels industry. Let's go for fish transformation. If you take these changes or these lack of changes and you add to this the fact that the government will exempt the fish and seafood processing industry from the temporary foreign workers regulations or more tighter regulation, would you actually say that the situation, especially in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI, is actually worse than it was maybe before 2011, definitely, and maybe even before this bill was proposed?
Right, and I'm not as up on the temporary foreign worker situation as I probably should be. However, we are concerned that there's going to be an influx of workers that are going to take the seasonal nature of the jobs, and so therefore we're going to have more displaced workers living in our region. So that's pretty much, that would be for certain a major concern for our area. What we really are calling for, and I want to make this point really clear, when Prince Edward Island is in full throttle, I call it, when all of our seasonal industries are going, we are the second highest rate of employment in the country. Islanders want to work, Atlantic Canadians want to work. The attitude around the fact that we just want to work 15 weeks and then draw EI is a barbaric old idea, and it needs to be gone away, and the policies in 2012 were actually based on that idea, that seasonal workers just want EI.
Yeah.
Mr. Ouellette.
Thank you very much to your Chair. So my first question is for Mrs. Smith from the Canada Teachers Federation. It's related to investment in First Nations education. So this is a major part of our budget, and we're investing around $2.6 billion in First Nations education and in schools. And I'd just like to have your opinion on in what manner this could be used to really improve the education system, because it's easy just to throw money at a problem, but I think really using that money to great effect and to understand how we can actually make a better education system, perhaps not the standalone schools, but what we could actually do to ensure that parents feel that the education represents them, that it represents schools, and that it's beneficial for the long term for Canada and especially for the children and their long-term future.
All right, I'll start, and maybe Mr. McGaughey, if permitted, will finish. I do want to say that Canadian Teachers Federation, for the most part, does not represent teachers in First Nations schools on reserve. However, we do represent teachers who teach many First Nations students across this country who are in public schools. That's not your question, but I just wanted to make that clear. I think that the first, we know that First Nation schools are severely underfunded. So yes, we don't want to just throw money at it, but it's certainly, the money is desperately needed. And I think we need to have the conversation. I think that those teachers and those education people on First Nations Reserve across this country know best what is needed. There are some examples of schools on reserve that are working in collaboration with provincial governments and with provincial teacher associations, and I think that certainly is a place to start. And I know in BC there is sort of a loose federation of on-reserve schools that do work some in coordination, so it's not just those 300 and whatever many standalone schools across the country. So I think those are the things, but I think we need to work in concert. I certainly don't have the answers, and I think that there could be some expertise tapped in from those who are presently working in the education system, and we'd be certainly willing to do that collaboration.
Okay.
You're good?
I have one more question, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, so my next final question, thank you very much, is for the conference board and Mr. Hodgson. It's related to productivity. I was reading a quick report here from the Library of Parliament for the House of Commons for the United Kingdom, and they're talking about productivity. And how will the investments, or how can we improve the productivity through the use of our investments in infrastructure to best effect?
Well, I mean, infrastructure investment by the public sector builds a foundation for your entire economy. We're arguably in catch-up mode now. We've probably gone 25 years in this country where we've chronically underinvested in infrastructure, and that's one of the many, many contributing factors to our weak productivity growth. So I think a foundational piece, whether it's the nature of our road system, bridges, ports, all the way across the economy, really provides a foundation for stronger productivity growth.
Mr. McColman.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll yield the first minute or so to Mr. Caron.
It's very appreciated. Merci beaucoup. Actually, I just wanted to have 1 minute to ask Mr. Hodgson. We talk about the budget, but there is a big provision in this bill, which is about bail-in, the bank capitalization. Did the conference board study the bail-in provisions? And knowing that this comes from an international attempt to protect the taxpayer, to protect the banks, to ensure that more stability, there's still some worries that eventually, through regulation, deposits could actually be used and redefined as long-term debt, so that they could be used to come back and to save the banks. Could you actually talk about what your perception of this provision is, and about the advantages and the risks that it has for the small-time depositor?
Mr. Caron, I'd love to be able to give you a material answer. Unfortunately, it's not a topic we've studied in detail. And I've learned that there are certain topics where, angels should fear to tread. And so I think on that one, I just as soon take a pass, and we can either have a conversation bilaterally, or we can identify it as an area which needs deeper research, because there clearly are risks on how you build backstops for your banking system, but it's not something we've examined in detail.
Thank you very much. Merci, Mr. McCollum.
Okay. Mr. Hodgson, I'd like to ask you regarding a couple of comments you made, and one was you alluded to balanced budgets, but the federal budget has no specific commitment to return to balanced budget, no plan over the short or long term to balancing the budget whatsoever. Is this the right direction for Canada?
Well, first off, I think we've probably put too much weight on a balanced budget per se. That's an easy communication tool with the broader public. For an economist, the really important thing is your debt-GDP ratio. And you're right, the ratio at the end of the budget planning period is pretty much the same as is at the beginning of the period. And we have said this publicly as well. I would have preferred a clear commitment to have a falling debt-GDP ratio over time, to ensure that we don't have a repeat of the 1970s, 1980s, and early part of the 1990s in this country, where we learned very painful lessons about not having kind of a long-term plan for fiscal policy. So it's a bit of a shortcoming in the budget, which of course could be addressed in future budgets.
Now, you also mentioned the decreasing amounts of money in private investment. Now, I've come from a business background, having owned my own business. I know that it's the entrepreneurs, the private business individuals who pay the taxes for the social programs, for all the benefits that we have in this country. And what is the long-term perspective if that continues to be the case, that private investment continues to invest elsewhere other than in Canada?
Well, I mean, if private investment doesn't grow, if you don't grow our capital base in the private sector, you can't become more competitive and productive down the road. We've clearly been affected by a loss of confidence in our economy since about 2010. And in fact, you can track the data and you see year after year where firms are sitting on cash rather than investing. So it is one of those sleeper but really fundamental issues for our economy over the coming generation.
The last question, if I have time, Chair, is you mentioned 9% of our revenue brought in is going to an expenditure item called debt repayment, and that's growing. And it's growing not only federally, but when you add the provincial debt onto the national debt, you find GDP ratios that are actually amazingly high compared to what OECD countries are doing. What is your belief in terms of when it's appropriate to reduce that number and not have it as large a percentage as it is today?
This is actually a topic I raise in almost every talk that I give, because we are a federation. You have to take the federal debt, actually add the provincial debt, because there's only one taxpayer by province. And so, and I don't mean to pick on Quebec, but Quebec has the highest ratio, a provincial debt burden of 50% of GDP, and federal at around, depending on how you measure it, 34%. That's the same level as the UK or France, right, who are seen as countries with too much debt. So there's a general consensus that somewhere between 80 and 85% of GDP is where capital markets start to pay far too much attention to debt burden, and you may start to lose access to capital. You certainly are going to pay a higher price for it, and you have to develop a serious strategy to ensure your debt's under control. The Americans are there now. As I mentioned, the UK and France are. As a federal government, we're a long way from that. We're clearly the best performer in the G7, but as a federation, we have to be very mindful of what each province is doing with its own debt strategy.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. McCollum and Mr. Hodgin. I just have one point I'd like to raise with Ms. McKay, and it relates to the PEI zones, just so committee members are aware. Prince Edward Island is about 250 kilometres long. We get 146,000 people. In my riding, the split between the zones is a place called the Riverdale Road. That is 20 kilometres out of Charlottetown, from the edge of Charlottetown. I have two constituents. One is on one side of the Riverdale Road, the other's on the other. They both work at the same place in the seasonal industry, New Glasgow Lobster Suppers. One barely qualifies for EI and gets a few weeks, and the other one qualifies substantially. Do I have that summed up right? And would you have any figures on what the difference would be in terms of those people's safety net out of the EI system for dollars?
I don't have the dollars, but that example is straight across the province. One of the things that I said when this was started was that we have people living in Charlottetown that work in the federal government job in Summerside, and we have people living in Summerside working in a federal government job in Charlottetown, and they crisscross each other on the road. We have a very unique situation in Prince Edward Island where there's no industry, as I said, that creates more work for folks, and that there's one area in the province that says you have more access to jobs. We have right across the province people working in the same job that live side by side, as you said, and it's everywhere. It's in every industry. For the seasonal workers in the city of Charlottetown, they got hit in 2012 with a loss of weeks, with a loss of benefit, and then in 2014 they got hit again simply because of where they lived. And I would ask for some folks certainly in the Liberal caucus to really take a look at why that zone was put in place. It was political and in nature, and it's really unfortunate because and the one part I'd like to mention is the new MP in the Egmont riding has fully supported repealing that zone change, even though every one of his constituents benefit, because he has constituents walking into his office that say it's unfair that my fellow islander is being mistreated and we want it changed. Now, having said that, all of the 2012 changes have to repeal in order for that to happen. But
I'll have to cut you there, Ms. McKay. We got. I would thank the witnesses for their presentation. We have a little bit of committee business that we have to do. So, thank you all for appearing. Starting, if I could, sorry, Mr. Caron, we are going to run tight on time. We need a motion on the budget to continue to hear our witnesses and for working meals. That budget requested would be $11,500, moved by Mr. McKinnon. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. The second order of business relates, well, just one thing I should mention for tomorrow. Tomorrow's meeting was scheduled from 3:30 till 6:30. Thank you, guests. There is a remarks in the House, an apology to the Kamagata Moreau, the whips have agreed to move committees back from 3:30 to 4. And so that will mean our meeting tomorrow won't start till 4 o'clock instead of the 3:30. The whips have agreed to that. I expect all the leaders are speaking. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I do know the whips agreed. So are we in agreement on that change? We would. Is there difficulty with ending later than 6:30? I would say we could go till 4 to 7 if we can, but if there's difficulty, we can tighten it up.
Do we need that much time? We don't need that much time. Do we
Pardon?
need that much time?
So it's officials.
So if we're done, we're done.
Yeah, when we're done, we're done. We'll try and finish it earlier than 7 for sure.
I have my private member's bill at 6:30.
The room change.
The officials that are coming, is that the officials that are coming then to where we can ask questions?
Yes, the officials, we didn't get through the list on officials last time, and there's a number of divisions that weren't covered.
Okay.
4, yeah. 5, I guess. 5. Yep.
Can I get confirmation again? When is Committee of the Whole scheduled and for what time?
Committee of the Whole is scheduled for the night of May 30th, starting at 7 o'clock.
For 4 hours?
Yes, 7 till, I'm not sure if it's 11 or 12 it ends.
Okay, thank you.
4 hours, I think, 4 hours.
Thank you.
Mr. Caron?
Rapidement, lorsque les fonctionnaires...
Very quickly, when the officials were here the last time, I had questions about the Balanced Budget Act, and the official had no answer. I was wondering if somebody from the Department of Justice could be there to answer those questions. Would it be possible to ensure that someone is there tomorrow?
Okay. And it will likely be, we're not sure yet, the meeting tomorrow in room 752, 131 Queen Street, because it's not a regular time slot, so we're getting moved elsewhere. But the clerk will send out that notice. 752, 131 Queen Street. Okay. One other point, and then we'll get to Mr. Caron's motion. On the documents from KPMG. KPMG contacted the clerk yesterday. Documents are expected to be delivered to the clerk at the end of the day today.
They're on their way, actually.
They're on their way now. There's a large volume of documents, 1.5 inches thick, 25 tabs, and they're in one language, the original language of the document. It's impossible to do translation to meet the motion's time frame. The documents would be distributed by messenger on Wednesday morning, and we'll be asking for a signature to confirm receipt of the document. But in order for us to receive them in one official language, we need a motion to allow the clerk to distribute those documents in one language. So the motion would read this way: that notwithstanding the routine motion adopted by the committee on February 4, 2016, where all documents distributed to members must be in both languages, the clerk be allowed to distribute to all members the document received from KPMG pursuant to the committee's request from May 5th, 2016, although these documents are currently only available in one language. Somebody want to move that? Moved by Mr. Caron. Any discussion? All those in favor? Carried, and that will be done. On Mr. Caron's motion, go ahead.
On m'a avisé que la formulation de la motion ne serait pas recevable
Just wait, I'm not getting...
Advised that the motion has not been considered receivable or admissible. Is it working? The wording of the motion is not considered acceptable, and so I would like to be able to withdraw it. However, I need to specify that my concern remains as to the construction, the form of this bill. This seems to be an omnibus bill because it has all the characteristics of an omnibus bill, including the fact that there are measures included which, even if they are part of the budget, should be studied by other committees, including Bill C-12, which has to do with compensating veterans, which should have been studied separately, not by the Finance Committee, but by the Veterans Affairs Committee. I think that's the most blatant example of this being an omnibus bill. In that sense, I would like the government to be more discerning with the tabling of this bill, and that it separate the sections that could be studied by other committees to which that business is relevant. I think that it's unfortunate that that is not the case, and I hope that this is not a signal from the government of how it's going to handle future budgets. Because at the end of the day, the House of Commons, the Parliament, is the one that suffers from it because it cannot study those bills in depth, and so I withdraw my motion.
Withdrawing your motion, and I think we do get the message that you've stated on the omnibus bill. Even if I look at it, there's several sections in there that I would honestly question. Is there any further discussion, any further business? Meeting adjourned.